at night, sometimes the Russians and Ukrainians would kind of curse each other across no man's land. They weren't about to play football. And indeed, the soldiers told me quite bleakly, oh yeah, once we went out to plant some mines in front of our position and a Russian radio man came up, he was confused and thought we were his fellow Russian soldiers. And so I said, well, what happened? And they were like, oh, well, we killed him. Another time, some Russian or two Russians crawled up through the undergrowth and offered to surrender. And I said, well, what do you do? And they said, well, we couldn't trust them, so we just shot at the sound of their voices. There's no love out there.
Today and online, you can read a dispatch from the Times special correspondent Anthony Loyd from Sumy in Ukraine. It brings home the reality of the war. While President Putin and Trump talk about a peace plan and European leaders rush across the Atlantic to try to shore it up, Russia is pounding Ukraine with rockets and shells every day. In Sumy, Ukraine has clawed back some land, but Russian troops outnumber the defenders 3-1. Anthony Loyd joins us now from Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. Anthony, good morning.
Good morning.
Can you just explain to us, you wrote it so beautifully, but it's so devastating, the realities of the absolutely grinding trench warfare for the Ukrainian soldiers?
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting to remember that as a diplomatic ping pong has gone on over the last 10 days, with meetings, or 2 weeks meetings in Alaska and Washington, and now back and forth and suggestions over security guarantees and such like, that in Ukraine, the war goes on. And I'm waking up this morning, there's already been air raid sirens going here. Kyiv under heavy attack last night, reports now of at least 8 dead and more expected to be found beneath the rubble in the capital. Those are the cities, that's the civilian population being targeted. But out on the front lines, and we've got to remember there's 1,200 kilometers of front lines here, the war goes on every day, heavy fighting along various stretches of the front as the Russians probe to find weak points and exploit them with their numerical advantage. So I spoke to Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting just north of Sumy in northern Ukraine, where they've managed to claw back a little bit of land lost to the Russians earlier in the summer. And they describe their life, due to the amount of drones now, they stay in the trenches or in their foxholes much longer than they used to, months in some cases, because they can't be rotated out by vehicles. It's very difficult to get to them. They're resupplied almost entirely by drones. Drones drop them their water, their food, their ammunition, their cigarettes. And their days are full of, rats. Rats are everywhere, feeding off the dead in the no man's land. Flies are everywhere. The whole place stinks. They're very thirsty a lot of the time in the summer fighting as well. Water's scarce. Some of the drone drops of bottled water rupture, so you get 8 guys having to kind of share out 1 bottle of water between them. And you've got to remember, too, this is a new generation of mobilized men. These are not men, perhaps, who volunteered at the start of the full-scale invasion. Very few of whom are now left alive at the front. It's a newer generation. They've got to be motivated to keep themselves in position with different thoughts.
And actually, you've been speaking to some of the officers in charge of the psychological support for particularly this 71st Brigade. How do you instill this sort of robustness, which means, OK, we go again tomorrow and again and again?
Well, there's a number of different things. One of the officers in charge of psychological support for that brigade told me rather bleakly that when he gets a new draft of mobilised men, they're facing huge challenges. They're going off to hold a trench. They don't know how long they're going to be there for a start, and human beings like to know how long they've got to do something nasty. They don't really know. They're told, well, it's going to be a minimum of 2 weeks, could be much longer, could be months. So he says to them, he told me, listen, you've got to think it's your key to long-term survival, using the same sort of psychological technique of those who survived the Nazi concentration camps in the war. If you think too far to the future, and if you allow your mind to wander too far into hope, you will likely be the first to be broken and not survive. Instead, try and gear your game of survival to each day, to each dawn. Just concentrate on getting through the day and on what you've got to do in those trenches on a day-to-day basis. Do not extend yourself into daydreaming of hope.
And in that brigade, I think you wrote, it has less than 15% of its original soldiers.
Yeah, that doesn't mean it's 85% under strength. It probably is under strength. But if we compare to the men who were in that brigade in 2022, the officers told me there were less than 15% of that old guard left. And I said, oh, well, have some been sent elsewhere to other units? And they were like, yeah, a few's been sent off to other units, but most of the 85% we're talking about have been wounded or have been killed in the last 3 years of fighting. They've been replaced by the newly mobilised.
The soldiers that you're speaking to, as there has been, well, sort of momentum, at least on the global diplomatic stage, a week ago, we were seeing all those European leaders who, went and wanted to stand alongside Zelensky to petition Donald Trump. Does any of that filter through to the conversations in the trenches and men thinking or believing they might be anywhere close to a peace deal?
That's a really interesting question. They said to me, yes, of course we talk about that. A lot of our comrades are dead, a lot are wounded, we're living doing this horrible stuff in the trenches. But we try not to let it get to us too much. We are aware of what's going on. We don't feel any connection to it at all. Because we're here in the trenches, there's no ceasefire or anything for us. We just have a day-to-day of fighting, of surviving, of defending our land. It feels that the diplomatic initiatives, as they described to me, were, and they used this phrase, in a parallel universe.
Some of the detail from your piece was difficult to read, actually. You said at night, the enemies across trenches are often shouting at each other. I mean, what is going on in those situations where you're engaging with the enemy, talking to them, realising you're going to have to kill them?
I don't think they were shouting at each other nicely. I don't think they were bidding each other good night. In the area that they were fighting, and this is on the Oleksivka front, just north of Sumy, the front lines are actually very close together. In some areas of Ukraine, you actually get them tremendously far apart. Sometimes no man's land is about 3 or 4 kilometres wide. If it's very flat country, up north of Sumy, it's much smaller, about 250 meters. So at night, sometimes the Russians and Ukrainians would kind of curse each other across no man's land. They weren't about to play football. And indeed, the soldiers told me quite bleakly, oh yeah, once we went out to plant some mines in front of our position and a Russian radio man came up, he was confused and thought we were his fellow Russian soldiers. And so I said, well, what happened? And they were like, oh, well, we killed him. Another time, some Russian or 2 Russians crawled up through the undergrowth and offered to surrender. And I said, well, what do you do? And they said, well, we couldn't trust them, so we just shot at the sound of their voices. There's no love out there.
Thank you so much for your time, Anthony. Anthony Loyd, the Times special correspondent on that, extraordinary dispatch from the grim reality of rats, feces, fire, open fire in the trenches, and how Russia are just slowly grinding on. It's a brilliant read. Take a look in the paper or online today.